The desert was still trembling from gunfire when he pulled the wounded Apache woman from the dirt, her breath thin, her life hanging by a thread. He carried her through the burning heat as the dying bandits cursed his name, promising that saving her would cost him everything. For days he kept her hidden in his modest cabin, listening to the wind shift in uneasy patterns across the valley. Something in that silence felt wrong, as if the land itself waited for judgment. And at dawn on the 5th day, the ground began to shake again. When he stepped outside, the horizon was black with riders. 500 Apache warriors had come to repay a debt no man could outrun. The ground shuddered beneath the cowboy as 500 riders closed in, their formation tightening like a storm wall pressing toward a lone outpost. Dust climbed into the sky in thick ribbons that dimmed the morning light and turned the valley into a muted haze. He stood motionless, the weight of silence heavier than the tremor under his boots. Behind him the cabin waited, small and fragile, holding the wounded Apache woman whose breath rose and fell in uncertain rhythm. He felt her presence even from a distance, as if the thread of her survival tethered him to the moment and bound him to the judgment now riding toward him. The air grew tense as the first ranks of warriors swept around his land in a widening circle, their horses moving with the disciplined force of river currents shaped by stone. Spears and rifles caught the pale sun, flashing with a cold brilliance that reminded him of the choice he had made when he lifted her from the dirt days earlier. He had not expected anything in return. He had not thought about consequences. He had only known that he could not leave her to die. That truth now stood before a verdict, delivered by 500 mounted shadows. His pulse quickened until it matched the rumble of hooves. The sound pressed into his ribs, steady and unrelenting. Every breath felt like a reckoning. He watched the riders spread across the valley, their numbers so vast that they seemed to stretch from one ridge to the other, turning the land into a moving tapestry of dust, leather, and painted determination. No part of his property escaped their gaze. No detail was left unnoticed. The entire valley held its breath with him. He took a single step forward, more instinct than courage, wanting to show that he would not run. The earth answered with a fresh vibration as the front line slowed to a measured pace. The warriors did not shout. They did not gesture. Their silence carried a weight sharper than any blade. It pressed against him until his legs felt rooted in the soil. Behind him, the faint memory of the woman stirred in his mind. Her fragile breathing had filled the cabin during the nights when he fought sleep and fear. She had been all but lost when he found her. Now her survival was the only thing he could offer as proof that he meant no harm. He hoped that would be enough. He feared it would not. The circle tightened once more, closing off every path of escape. Shadows lengthened across his boots. The riders halted as one living force. In that stillness, the cowboy felt the world pause. Judgment had arrived, and he stood alone beneath a sky thick with dust and expectation, waiting for whatever came next. He steadied his breath as the valley seemed to lean toward him, urging him to hold firm while the power of their gathering settled around his land. The valley held its stillness as the riders settled into their ring, and with no voice calling out and no command yet given, the cowboy felt his thoughts pulled backward into the memory he had tried to bury. The dust before him blurred into the dust of days earlier, when the sun had been low and the air carried the sharp scent of smoke. He had been riding back from the creek when he first heard the gunfire. Sharp bursts. Sudden silence. Then a single cry cut short. He remembered how he stopped on the ridge, hidden behind stone, watching the bandits circle something on the ground. Their laughter rose into the dry air, a cruel sound that stuck to the inside of his chest. He should have turned away. He almost did. He remembered his hesitation with painful clarity. The familiar weight of cowardice pressed against him in that moment. He had lived with it for years, a quiet shadow born from all the times he had come too late or chosen not to step in at all. Faces blurred by time drifted through his thoughts. People he had failed. Moments where silence had been easier than action. Each one had carved a line into him. Each one had taught him the cost of looking away. That long history sat heavy in his saddle as he watched the bandits. Then he saw her. She lay in the dirt like a broken branch, her body twisted, her breath barely visible. The bandits had left her for dead. Her face was marked with dust and blood, yet beneath it he saw defiance still clinging to her. Something inside him shifted then, a small but unmovable force rising from the place where regret lived. It was not anger. It was not bravery. It was a quiet ache that told him he could not walk away again. Not this time. Not after all those other times. He rode toward the bandits even as fear clawed at him. He remembered how his hands shook when he lifted his rifle. The fight that followed was frantic and clumsy. He was outnumbered and outmatched, driven more by desperation than skill. When the final bandit fell, the silence that followed felt strange and hollow. He knelt beside the woman, unsure if she could hear him or even feel his presence. She was barely conscious, her skin cold under the afternoon sun. He had carried her to his horse, feeling the weight of her life settle against him like a fragile oath. That memory pressed hard against him now as the warriors studied him from the valley floor. He understood that saving her had not been an act of heroism. It had been a plea to his own spirit to rise from the failures of his past, but redemption had never been free. He felt its cost building in the air around him, a pressure that matched the watchful eyes of 500 riders. The barren land seemed to lean into that truth, reminding him that moral consequence had finally found him. The front of the vast formation shifted, and from it rode a smaller group of warriors who moved with the precision of a blade sliding free from its sheath. Their horses advanced in a steady line, hooves thudding against the hard earth in deliberate rhythm. Dust lifted around them but did not dare disturb their focus. Their presence carried a fierce restraint, the kind that held more danger than open rage. The cowboy felt the air tighten as they drew near, each rider studying him with eyes sharp enough to cut through any falsehood he might try to hide. They halted just a few paces from him. No voices rose, no gestures softened the moment. One rider nudged his horse forward, and the slight shift forced the cowboy a step back toward his cabin. Another rider placed a hand on the haft of his spear, not lifting it but making sure the cowboy saw the ease with which it could rise. The message was clear. They would examine everything. They would judge everything, and they would allow no mistake. The cowboy's breath felt trapped beneath his ribs, yet he kept his stance steady. He let them guide him backward, though every instinct inside him wanted to brace against the pressure. Their silent command pressed him toward the cabin door. He could feel the weight of their suspicion in each movement they made, in the careful way they scanned the ground, the walls, the tracks near the porch. Nothing escaped their notice. Even the faint imprint of his boots beside the water bucket seemed to draw their scrutiny. One warrior dismounted with a smooth motion, his boots landing softly but with purpose. He moved toward the side of the cabin and traced a hand across the rough boards, testing for fresh marks or signs of disturbance. Another checked the window, leaning close, eyes narrowing as he peered into the dim interior. A third stayed near the cowboy, close enough that the warmth of the horse drifted over him, but distant enough to show that no trust existed yet. Their silence was a language shaped by discipline and fire. He understood every unspoken question they placed before him. His pulse hammered harder as two of the warriors approached the door. The cabin seemed impossibly small now, its doorway a fragile border between life and judgment. The woman lay inside, wrapped in the blankets he had arranged, surrounded by the meager supplies he had gathered. He had done everything he could, but he feared it might not be enough. He feared some detail he overlooked would be interpreted as disrespect or harm. The warriors paused at the threshold, their attention fixed on the faint sound of her breathing from within. The moment stretched thin, nearly breaking under its own pressure. The cowboy felt the valley constrict around him, as if every rock and shadow bowed toward this single decision. He understood with absolute clarity that this next step, this moment of inspection, held his fate. The truth of his care would speak louder than any plea he could offer. If they found neglect or doubt, he would not see another sunrise. If they found compassion, there might be a chance. The air tasted of dust and consequence as the warriors prepared to enter the cabin and decide whether he lived or died. The interior of the cabin felt smaller than ever as the warriors stepped inside, their shadows stretching across the floorboards like an omen. The cowboy remained just outside the doorway, close enough to witness every movement, but distant enough to show respect. The air held a stillness that pressed tight against his lungs. The warriors knelt beside the woman, their grave focus turning the room into a silent tribunal. One reached toward her without hesitation, his touch careful yet firm, assessing the rise and fall of her breath. She remained fragile, suspended somewhere between this world and the one that waited beyond the horizon. Their eyes moved to the items surrounding her, the cloths he had soaked and folded, the water he kept within reach, the salve he had used sparingly, fearing it might sting her injuries. The blankets cocooned around her, to hold warmth against her weakened body. None of these things carried the handprint of recklessness. Every detail spoke of intention, of care, of time spent tending to her when no one else would. The warriors examined each element with the seriousness of men searching for truth rather than comfort. A subtle shift passed through the room. The tension that had entered with them loosened, not fully, but enough that the cowboy felt a faint thread of breath return to him. Their eyes no longer burned with immediate accusation. Instead, a deeper, more complex silence began to fill the space. It was not forgiveness. It was not trust. It was the questioning stillness that comes when suspicion must wrestle with undeniable evidence. He could feel the land itself holding still around the structure. Even the wind outside had ceased brushing against the walls. It seemed as if the entire valley waited to see their judgment, poised between two fates. The cowboy watched the warriors exchange glances, subtle and wordless, but heavy with meaning. They had found no cruelty in the cabin, no sign that he had mistreated her. The truth of his effort lay plain before them. When the warriors lifted her, they did so with reverence, their hands steady and respectful. As they adjusted the blankets, the fabric slipped just enough to reveal the marks carved into her skin by the bandits who had left her to die. A long, quiet ache crossed the faces of the warriors. The brutality was unmistakable. No act of the cowboy could have caused those wounds. They were deep, violent, and inflicted with a cruelty he could never imagine. That truth settled in the room like a final verdict. The warriors covered her again and steadied her breathing with practiced movements. Their posture changed, shoulders lowered, eyes softened by a fraction. One of them nodded almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging that the cowboy had done more than survive a violent encounter. He had chosen to protect someone who had been left broken by merciless hands. From the doorway, the cowboy felt a fragile ember of hope kindle in his chest. He sensed that this moment marked the first small turning. Not acceptance, not safety, but the faint recognition that he might stand before them not as a threat, but as a protector who had stepped into the storm when he could have turned away. The warriors moved with measured precision as they carried the wounded woman out of the cabin, their steps steady and deliberate. The sunlight touched her face gently, revealing how fragile she still was, how close she remained to slipping beyond reach. They brought her toward a small medic group that had already assembled near the center of the vast formation. Hundreds of riders watched in unnerving stillness, their gaze turning the valley into a vast arena where every breath the cowboy took felt magnified and judged. He stood alone before them, the emptiness around him harsh and unforgiving. The silence that followed pressed down like a physical weight. No wind moved through the sagebrush. No bird called across the open sky. The cowboy felt the eyes of 500 warriors fixed upon him, each one silent, unblinking, and fiercely aware. He did not move. He did not look away. His body remained steady, but inside he felt a rising tightness that squeezed against his lungs. The valley had become a place where truth stood exposed, and he felt the full gravity of that exposure. The war leader approached on horseback, his posture straight and commanding. His horse stepped with dignified restraint, its breath clouding softly in the warm air. The leader paused a short distance from the cowboy, staring down with a level, unreadable expression. Their eyes locked, and in that moment the cowboy felt the tension coil even tighter, as though the land itself strained to hold the silence. The war leader studied him as if weighing his intentions, his strength, and his spirit all at once. The cowboy remembered every warning he had ever heard about becoming entangled in tribal matters. Neighbors had told stories of misunderstandings that spiraled into bloodshed. Travelers had spoken of conflicts born from fear and pride. None of those warnings had stopped him days earlier, but now their echoes pressed against his mind. He wondered whether he had condemned himself by following the pull of compassion rather than the instinct for self-preservation. He wondered if redemption always demanded this harsh a price. The war leader shifted slightly, a subtle gesture that snapped the tension like a fraying rope. He lifted one hand with grave authority, weapons across the formation lowered in response, but not fully. The blades dipped, rifles eased downward, yet each still hovered in readiness. The message was unmistakable. The cowboy was no longer seen as an immediate enemy, but neither was he considered safe. He had been granted a temporary stay, not trust. A faint tremor of fear passed through him as he absorbed the meaning of the gesture. The warriors were not leaving. They were settling in. All around him, riders dismounted with deliberate movements, forming a disciplined rhythm as they unpacked supplies. Tents rose from the valley floor. Fires were prepared. Guards positioned themselves in rotating patterns. The land that had once felt wide open now closed around him with an iron sense of purpose. He was not free, not yet forgiven. The camp around his property signaled that judgment had merely stepped into a new stage. He remained at the center of their attention, living under a watchful silence that weighed as heavily as any chain. The valley braced itself alongside him, holding the breath of a fate still undecided. The war leader dismounted with a slow, deliberate motion that rippled through the camp like a shift in the wind. Warriors nearby straightened as he touched the ground, for it was uncommon for a man of his rank to approach anyone on foot. The cowboy felt a new weight settle on the air, different from the tension that had choked the valley earlier. This was heavier, older, shaped by tradition and consequence. The leader stepped toward him, each footfall measured, steady, and quiet. The surrounding warriors watched with cautious anticipation, their stances rigid yet attentive. The leader began to circle the cowboy, studying him as if reading a story written in scars, dirt, and silence. His gaze swept over the cowboy's boots, the dust on his clothing, the dried blood near his sleeve that did not belong to him. The cowboy held still, not in defiance but in respect, letting the leader take in every detail. The atmosphere shifted from accusation to something more intricate, a fragile recognition that hovered between them like a thin veil waiting to be pierced. The leader halted beside the medic group where the wounded woman lay. Her breathing remained faint, her face pale beneath the shadow of the afternoon sun. The leader knelt and examined the bandages the cowboy had wrapped around her wounds. His fingers brushed the cloth gently. He paused, then lifted his head and looked toward the cabin where the supplies had been gathered, where the cowboy had kept vigil through the long nights. In that small nod toward the cabin, the cowboy saw acknowledgement, not approval yet, but recognition of the care that had kept her alive. A subtle murmur moved through the nearby warriors. Their rigid postures softened, shoulders loosening, hands lowering slightly from weapons. They stepped back a few paces, creating space around the cowboy that had not existed moments earlier. It was not an invitation. It was an indication that the ground beneath him had shifted, that his place among them, while precarious, was no longer carved entirely from suspicion. The war leader rose to his feet and faced him fully. He spoke only a few quiet words, their meaning carried not by volume but by the gravity in his tone. The cowboy did not need the exact translation to understand. The tribe had accepted that his actions had saved the woman's life. They had seen the truth of his intentions. A debt now existed between them, carved into the fabric of their traditions as surely as any mark on a warrior's shield. But the weight of that debt pressed down on the cowboy with a seriousness that tightened his chest. This was not a simple gesture of thanks. This was a sacred obligation, a bond that carried expectations shaped by heritage and honor. Debts of this magnitude were never light, and they were never without danger. The cowboy felt the ground steady beneath his feet even as the uncertainty deepened. The war leader's gaze held him in a quiet understanding that the path ahead would demand courage far beyond what had already been given. The war leader stepped back, and with his retreat came a shift in the air. Several warriors approached the cowboy with a solemn gravity, their expressions carved from the weight of news that carried more danger than any accusation. They did not raise their weapons. They did not posture for dominance. Instead, they stood before him with the calm intensity of men, bearing truth that could change the shape of a land. One warrior gestured toward the wounded woman, then toward the distant ridges where the horizon burned beneath the afternoon sun. The message unfolded through their deliberate motions, revealing the story he had not yet understood. The bandits who had attacked her were not a wandering group of reckless thieves. They were part of a gang that had stained the region with their violence for months, leaving wounded travelers, burned settlements, and stolen supplies in their wake. The woman had not been their first victim. She would not have been their last. The cowboy had known nothing of the full extent of their cruelty when he found her. He had only seen one life slipping away. Now he learned that her suffering was a fragment of a much wider trail of devastation. The warriors pointed toward the hills, their eyes narrowing, as if tracking movement no one else could see. They explained through gestures and firm expressions that the gang had grown bold, targeting anyone who crossed their path. The cowboy felt a cold recognition settle inside him. By intervening days earlier, he had not merely saved one woman. He had crossed a line that placed him in the path of a far larger storm. The gang would not forget the man who disrupted their cruelty. They would come for him. The warriors made that truth clear. One of them traced a rough circle in the dirt around the cowboy's land. It was not a symbol of protection, but a representation of the pressure that now surrounded him. By saving her, he had stepped directly into the conflict that the Apache had been forced to endure for too long. Justice demanded pursuit. Justice demanded reckoning. And justice demanded a stand against the gang that had wounded their people and darkened the region with fear. The war leader lifted his arm, and scouts immediately broke away from the formation. riding up the nearest ridges and slipping into the scattered brush with skilled swiftness. Their silhouettes vanished into the hills, becoming part of the land itself. The valley transformed in an instant. What had once been open ground now felt like a battlefield waiting for a spark. Every distant shadow carried threat. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper warning. The cowboy felt the tension coil across the landscape like a tightened rope ready to snap. He understood then that the warriors had not come only to repay a debt. Their presence was larger, heavier, rooted in a long history of loss and endurance. They had come because the attack on the woman was another strike in a series of wounds inflicted upon their people. They had come because justice demanded strength, and they had come because the gang, now aware of the cowboy's interference, would be hunting him with the same merciless intent. The valley grew still as the truth settled around him. The tribe had arrived not for gratitude but for preparation. The land was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become ground waiting for war. The shadows on the ridges shifted first, faint movements that signaled the return of the scouts. They descended in swift silence, their horses breathing hard, their faces hardened by the urgency of what they had seen. As they approached the war leader, the entire formation stirred like a living thing bracing for impact. The cowboy watched from the edge of the clearing, sensing the heaviness in their posture before any message was conveyed. When the scouts halted and delivered their findings through gestures and grave expressions, a wave of tension rippled through the valley. Bandits were closing in. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was coming toward them with violent purpose. The war leader raised his hand, and the warriors moved with disciplined coordination. Lines formed across the valley floor, each position chosen with careful intent. Riders split into groups, some taking high ground, others reinforcing the perimeter near the cabin. The cowboy found himself pulled into the rising momentum. A few warriors gestured for him to follow, pointing toward his cabin walls and signaling the areas that needed strengthening. There was no hostility in their movements now, only necessity. He set to work without hesitation, dragging heavy planks from the shed and bracing them against the cabin's weakest points. The warriors joined him, handing him tools, reinforcing corners, and inspecting the structure with practiced eyes. The pounding of nails echoed through the clearing, sharp and rhythmic, blending with the distant calls of scouts reporting shifting movement in the hills. The cowboy followed every command given. He did not question. He did not falter. Through action he offered the only language that mattered in moments like this: effort, resolve, shared purpose. As they worked, a subtle trust began to take shape. Warriors glanced at him with acknowledgement rather than suspicion. When he pointed out a blind corner near the corral where bandits could slip through unnoticed, the war leader's second examined the spot and nodded approval. Warriors adjusted their formation according to his guidance. A small but meaningful thread of respect wove between them, built not from words but from sweat, labor, and the looming weight of the coming danger. Inside the cabin, the wounded woman stirred for the first time since the warriors had carried her out. The medic group called for stillness. The cowboy stepped into the dim interior, feeling the air thicken with quiet hope. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found him. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that single connection. She saw him, not as an outsider, not as a stranger, but as the man who had lifted her from the dirt when all seemed lost. Her gaze trembled with recognition, and in it he felt gratitude, pain, and a fragile thread of understanding that bridged the space between him and her people. When she drifted back into rest, he stepped outside again. Dusk had begun to settle across the valley, spreading long shadows over the defensive lines. Campfires sparked to life one by one, their flames reflecting off sharpened blades and casting flickering light across stern faces. The smell of smoke intertwined with the cold bite of the coming night. Warriors stood ready, their silhouettes unyielding against the darkening horizon. The cowboy felt the weight of anticipation settle deep into his bones. Night fell heavy across the land, carrying the promise of violence. The campfires glowed like scattered warnings across the valley floor. In their firelit reflections, the cowboy saw the truth of the moment. The storm was not approaching. It was already here, waiting for the dawn to break and reveal its full force. The first light of dawn crawled over the ridges, pale and cold, barely touching the valley before the world erupted. Gunfire cracked through the early silence like tearing cloth. Shouts rose from the hills as the bandits charged with reckless fury, their silhouettes bursting from the darkness with the wild energy of men who believed brutality could still deliver them victory. The Apache warriors answered in an instant. 500 riders surged forward, their movements unified and fierce, a storm of strength unleashed with precise purpose. The cowboy pushed away fear as he joined their line. The ground shook beneath the thunder of galloping horses, each hoofbeat driving a pulse of urgency through the valley. Warriors streaked past him, arrows slicing the air, rifles firing with disciplined cadence, the scent of dust and gunpowder blended with the rising heat of the fight. Chaos surrounded him, but he held tight to the sense of responsibility that had guided every step since he lifted the woman from the dirt. This battle was no longer just theirs. It had become his. The bandits crashed into the valley floor in a violent swarm. Steel clashed against steel. Horses reared and screamed. Men grappled in the dirt as the sun clawed its way higher. The cowboy found himself face to face with the brutality he had glimpsed days earlier. He fought with raw instinct, each motion pulled from a deep place inside him where regret had lived for too long. Every swing of his rifle butt and every fired round carried the weight of choices past and present. The tide of battle surged around him until a sudden opening revealed the one man he had hoped and feared to face. The bandit leader moved through the chaos with a predatory certainty, his eyes fixed on the cowboy with fierce recognition. This was the man who had left the woman broken in the dirt. The man whose cruelty had ignited the chain of events that now roared across the valley. The cowboy felt the world narrow around them as he stepped forward, drawn into a confrontation that felt both inevitable and long overdue. Their struggle was desperate and brutal. Dust rose around them as they grappled, each blow sharp with the force of guilt and vengeance. The leader struck with seasoned cruelty, but the cowboy fought with something deeper. A burning resolve shaped by the memory of the woman's fragile breaths and the fear that he would fail yet another soul. When he finally drove the man to the ground, breath ragged and limbs trembling, he felt a shudder move through his body. It was not triumph, it was release. Across the valley the battle began to shift. Warriors pushed the remaining bandits back, breaking their lines and forcing them to scatter toward the ridges. Some fell, some fled. Others were captured and bound. Slowly, the roar of conflict faded into a strained quiet. Dust swirled above the valley, carrying the scent of sweat, blood, and extinguished fury. The cowboy stood amid the settling chaos, chest heaving, gaze sweeping across the land that had been reshaped by violence. The valley bore scars now, so did he. But the storm had passed, leaving behind the stillness of a world forever changed. The valley settled into a strained quiet as the last echoes of battle faded into the morning air. Smoke drifted in thin strands above the trampled earth, rising from the remnants of gunfire and the small fires lit to treat the wounded. The sun crept higher, casting a soft glow across the battlefield, revealing bodies, broken weapons, and scattered traces of the violent storm that had torn through the land only moments earlier. The cowboy stood at the edge of the clearing, chest still rising with the lingering force of exertion, but his eyes remained fixed on the warriors moving with solemn determination through the aftermath. He stepped forward without waiting to be asked. Apache healers had begun tending to their injured, lifting wounded riders from the dust and carrying them toward the medic tents. The cowboy joined them, offering his hands to support a fallen warrior whose leg trembled under his weight. Together they guided him to safety, their movements steady despite exhaustion. Another warrior called out, and the cowboy crossed the battlefield to lift a man whose arm hung limp at his side. Sweat mixed with dust on the cowboy's skin, but he did not pause. His actions carried the quiet sincerity of a man who understood that loyalty must be proven through effort, not words. The Apache took notice. They watched him move among them, not as an outsider seeking favor, but as someone who shared the burden of loss and responsibility. Some gave him small nods. Others met his gaze with a new softness, a silent acknowledgement earned in the harshest of ways. The valley, once tight with suspicion, now opened around him with a fragile sense of unity. The war leader approached from the far side of the battlefield, walking with the calm authority of a man who had witnessed both the cost and the necessity of conflict. He stopped before the cowboy, his expression neither joyful nor grim, but weighted with deep understanding. The leader's presence marked the end of the chaos. It signaled closure, the final sealing of a brutal chapter. The cowboy bowed his head slightly, not as submission but in recognition of the bond forged in the fire of battle. Movement near the medic tents drew their attention. The wounded woman, now resting on a bed of layered blankets, had awakened fully. Her eyes opened with greater clarity than before, the fog of injury lifting just enough for her to recognize the world around her. When she saw the cowboy standing under the soft morning light, her expression shifted. Her breathing grew steadier. The faint crease of fear smoothed from her brow. Gratitude radiated from her in a quiet, profound way that required no speech. It was carried in the way her eyes softened and in the fragile strength that flickered beneath her exhaustion. The cowboy felt something settle within his chest. A slow exhale escaped him, carrying with it the weight of the days he had lived under threat and uncertainty. He looked out over the valley, seeing the marks left by battle, the warriors moving with purpose, and the woman whose life had drawn all of them into this violent convergence. One act of mercy had summoned 500 riders, reshaped alliances, and carved new lines across the land. He understood now that the consequences of compassion could ripple farther than fear ever dared. The valley began its slow return to order as the morning wore on. The wounded had been tended to, the captured bandits secured, and the last remnants of chaos swept aside by disciplined hands. A quiet resolve settled over the Apache warriors as they prepared to depart, their movements deliberate, shaped by the weight of what had occurred. Horses were saddled, supplies gathered, and lines reformed with the same precision that had carried them into battle. The cowboys stood at the edge of their activity, watching as the rhythm of their departure took shape like the closing of a long, hard chapter. The war leader approached once more, his presence steady, his expression marked by a gravity that carried both respect and finality. He held a small carved object in one hand, its surface darkened by age and polished by the touch of generations. It was not large, but its weight seemed immense, carrying the depth of tradition and the quiet history of his people. When he offered it to the cowboy, the gesture came with no flourish. It was simple, direct, and sincere, the kind of acknowledgment reserved for deeds that could not be repaid with words alone. The cowboy accepted the gift with careful hands, feeling the texture of the carving beneath his fingers. The object felt alive with meaning, a silent testament to the courage he had shown and the risk he had taken for someone who had been a stranger. The war leader met his gaze and held it for a long, steady moment. In that exchange lay a mutual understanding, forged through turmoil and hardened in the crucible of conflict. It was an understanding that did not require language to exist. Nearby, the wounded woman was lifted gently by the medics who would carry her back to her people. She rested in a cradle of blankets, her breathing steadier, her strength slowly returning. As they raised her onto the waiting horse, she turned her head with a final effort. Her eyes sought the cowboy. When she found him, a quiet brightness passed across her expression, fragile yet powerful. There was no need for spoken gratitude. The connection that passed between them held more truth than any sound could have carried. It lingered as she was carried away, a thread stretching across the distance until the moment she vanished into the forming line. The warriors mounted and began their long ride out of the valley. One by one their silhouettes stretched across the open land, shrinking as they moved toward the horizon. Dust rose beneath their hooves, drifting like a farewell that hung in the warming air. The cowboy watched until the last rider disappeared beyond the distant ridge, leaving the valley empty once more. Silence settled over the land, a stillness that felt both heavy and cleansing. He turned toward his cabin, stepping through the doorway into the familiar space that now carried the imprint of everything that had unfolded. The bed held the faint indent where she had rested. Bandage strips lay folded on the table, remnants of nights spent keeping her alive. He placed the carved gift beside them, its presence anchoring the room with quiet meaning. In the silence he felt the truth settle deep within him. Honor, once chosen, did not fade with the departing riders. It remained, shaping the path ahead, echoing through the quiet spaces of a man's life long after the dust had settled.